Admiral Vactor stood at the center of his command ship, looking out at the stars through a massive window. Below him, hundreds of alien ships moved in perfect lines toward the Corvani homeworld. Each ship carried tribute from conquered worlds: gold, rare metals, food, and sometimes slaves. This had been happening for 4,000 years without fail. The bridge around him buzzed with quiet activity. His crew, tall reptilian beings with dark green scales, worked at their stations with practiced ease. The Corvani had been the masters of the galaxy for so long that most species had forgotten what freedom looked like. They conquered worlds not through brutal force alone, but through patient strategy and overwhelming power. No one had ever successfully resisted them. "Sir," called his communications officer from across the bridge. "We have the survey report from the Outer Rim territories." Vactor barely looked up from the tactical display he was studying. Another report about another primitive world, no doubt. The galaxy was full of young species that thought they were important until they met the Corvani Empire. "What system?" he asked without interest. "Sol system, sir." "Third planet from their star?" "They call themselves humans." Vactor finally glanced at the data flowing across his personal screen. The information was typical of most primitive species they encountered. The humans had split themselves into dozens of small governments that constantly fought each other. They made decisions based on emotions rather than logic. Their technology was laughably basic. They had only just begun to explore beyond their own star system. "Population?" he asked. "Approximately 8 billion on their homeworld, sir." "Maybe 2 million scattered across their system in small colonies?" Vactor nodded. "A decent population for tribute collection, but nothing special."
Right.
Humans would make adequate workers once they understood their place in the galaxy. Weapons capability? Primitive nuclear weapons, basic energy shields, conventional projectile weapons. Their largest warships are smaller than our patrol boats. The Admiral almost smiled. Every species went through the same stages of development, and the humans were exactly where they should be for their age. Young, aggressive, and completely unprepared for what existed beyond their small corner of space. "File the report with the Expansion Planning Division," Vactor ordered. "When we reach their sector in the next campaign cycle, we'll send the standard ultimatum: submission or destruction." His communications officer hesitated for a moment. "Sir, there is one unusual note in the report." "What is it?" "The humans seem to have an unusual cultural trait. Their history shows they have a tendency to fight even when victory is impossible. Even when completely outnumbered, they continue to resist." Vactor finally turned to look at his officer directly. "All primitive species think they can fight the inevitable. The Zenthari believe the same thing. So did the Vexillon." "All learned eventually." "Yes, sir, but the humans seem different. They have a saying, 'Never give up, never surrender.'" The Admiral laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the bridge. "Words. All species have brave words until they see a Corvani battle fleet in their sky. Then they remember their place." Admiral Vactor did not know was that at that very moment, millions of light years away, Captain Lee Minho was making a discovery that would change everything. The human explorer had landed on a small planet in a system that both humans and Corvani claimed as territory. The world seemed empty, but buried beneath its surface were ruins older than the Corvani Empire itself. Lee Minho stood in the ancient chamber, his helmet lights illuminating walls covered in symbols that his translation software could not recognize. The architecture was unlike anything in human databases, but more importantly, it was unlike anything in the Corvani records either. These ruins predated the current galactic order by thousands of years. "Captain," his science officer called from across the chamber, "these energy readings are off the charts. Whatever civilization built this place had technology that makes ours look primitive." Lee Minho nodded, but his attention was focused on a series of star maps carved into the chamber walls. The maps showed the galaxy as it had been long ago, before the Corvani Empire existed. And according to these ancient records, the Corvani had not always been the masters of space. "Record everything," he ordered. "If these ruins are what I think they are, we may have just found evidence that the Corvani Empire can be defeated." Back on the Corvani flagship, Admiral Vactor returned to his daily reports. unaware that the balance of galactic power was about to shift. The tribute ships continued their endless procession, carrying wealth from 1,000 worlds to feed the Empire's hunger. The stars looked the same as they had from Millennia, cold and distant and unchanging. But change was coming, carried by a species too young to know they were supposed to be afraid and too stubborn to accept defeat even when it seemed certain. The Corvani had ruled through fear and overwhelming force for 4,000 years, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to stay defeated. The first stirrings of the greatest war in galactic history had begun, and neither side knew it. Yet, the space around the ancient planet Kepler 4 seemed peaceful until 3 large Corvani warships suddenly appeared from hyperspace. Their dark hulls gleamed with red markings that every spacefaring species had learned to fear. The ships moved with deadly grace, surrounding the small human research vessel like wolves circling a lone deer. Captain Lee Minho gripped the arms of his command chair as the alien ships took position around his ship. The New Horizon was a science vessel, not a warship. It carried advanced scanning equipment and archaeological tools, but its weapons were minimal. Against 3 Corvani battlecruisers, they might as well have been throwing rocks. "Captain," called Park Juan from the communications station, her voice tight with worry. "I'm picking up a transmission from the lead ship." "Put it through," Minho ordered, trying to keep his voice steady for his crew. The voice that came through the speakers was cold and emotionless, speaking perfect standard language with an accent that suggested the speaker considered himself superior to whoever was listening. "Unknown human vessel, you are trespassing in territory claimed by the Corvani Empire. You will surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in your destruction." Minho looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. Navigator Kim Sunho was already working at his station, trying to find an escape route, but they all knew it was hopeless. Corvani ships had them completely surrounded. "This is Captain Lee Minho of the Human Colonial Alliance research vessel New Horizon," he replied, standing up from his chair. "We are conducting peaceful archaeological research on the planet below. This system is not marked as Corvani territory. In any of our star charts, we are willing to discuss this situation and find a peaceful solution." There was a long pause, and the Corvani voice spoke again. And this time, there was something like amusement in the cold tone. "Discuss? You do not discuss with the Corvani Empire, human? You obey or you die?" Before Minho could respond, the lead Corvani ship opened fire. A massive energy beam struck the research station on the planet's surface, completely destroying it in a ball of fire that could be seen from space. 12 human scientists and archaeologists died instantly. Vaporized, along with weeks of careful research work, the bridge of the New Horizon fell silent. Park Juan stared at her console in shock. Kim Sunho stopped calculating escape routes and just watched the burning remains of the station falling through the planet's atmosphere. "Sir," Park Juan whispered, "the lead ship is charging weapons again. They're targeting us." This was the moment that would puzzle Corvani military analysts for months afterward. Every species the Corvani had ever encountered followed the same pattern. When faced with overwhelming force, they either surrendered immediately or tried to run. No species had ever chosen to fight when defeat was certain. But Captain Lee Minho was human, and humans had never learned to back down from bullies. "All hands, battle stations," he announced over the ship's communication system. "Charge all weapons and prepare for combat." "Sir," Kim Sunho said, turning in his chair, "we can't win this fight. They have 3 warships to our 1 science vessel." "No," Minho replied quietly. "But they just murdered 12 of our people in cold blood. We're going to make them pay for it." The New Horizon turned toward the nearest Corvani ship and opened fire with everything it had. The human ship's weapons were designed for clearing space debris and basic defense. Not for fighting battle cruisers, but they struck the Corvani vessel's shields with bright flashes of energy. The Corvani response was swift and overwhelming. Energy beams from all 3 ships converged on the small human vessel, tearing through its shields and armor like paper. The New Horizon shook violently. As explosions rocked the ship from bow to stern, "Hull breach on decks 3 and 4, someone shouted over the alarms. "Life support failing, called another voice. But even as his ship died around him, Captain Lee Minho kept fighting. The New Horizon continued firing until the very last moment, its weapons blazing defiance at an enemy that could have destroyed them a dozen times over. "Captain," Park Juan called out, blood running down her face from a head wound. "I've got a transmission ready to send to Earth. Everything we've recorded, including the attack on the station. Send it," Minho ordered. "Make sure they know what happened here." The transmission shot out into hyperspace just as the final Corvani salvo struck the New Horizon. The human ship exploded in a brilliant flash, taking all hands with it. But the message was already traveling toward Earth at faster-than-light speed. Admiral Victor reviewed the battle report later that day, frowning at his tactical display. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes and had ended exactly as expected with complete Corvani victory. But something about the human response bothered him. Why did they attack? He asked his tactical officer. They had to know they couldn't win? Unknown, sir. Perhaps they were malfunctioning. But Victor knew better. The humans had made a choice that no other species had ever made when faced with Corvani power. They had chosen to fight and die rather than surrender. What he didn't understand was that this was exactly how humans had always responded to overwhelming odds throughout their history. And now, their message was racing toward Earth carrying news that would change everything. The emergency meeting hall on Earth had never seen anything like this. President Kim Do-ho stood at the center podium, his face pale but determined as he watched the final transmission from the HFY New Horizon play on the giant screens around the chamber. The footage showed the Corvani ships destroying the research station without warning, killing 12 innocent scientists who had been studying ancient ruins. Around him, representatives from every human colony and settlement sat in stunned silence. The chamber that usually echoed with debates about trade routes and mining rights now held the weight of a decision that would determine humanity's future. Some representatives wept openly as they watched Captain Lee Min-ho's ship make its final desperate attack against impossible odds. "My fellow humans," President Kim began when the footage ended. "We have received our first message from the galactic community. The Corvani Empire considers us insects to be stepped on," they murdered. "Our people without even attempting to communicate. They expect us to surrender our freedom and become their slaves." Representative Choi Min-ji from the Mars colonies stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "Mr. President, we cannot let this stand. Those were our people, our scientists. They were murdered in cold blood while conducting peaceful research." General Park Tae-yeon, the head of Earth's military forces, stood next. His weathered face showed the strain of the impossible situation they faced. "Madam Representative, I understand your anger, but we must face reality. Our entire military consists of maybe 200 ships that could be called warships. Most of those are patrol boats and system defense craft. The Corvani Empire spans thousands of star systems. Intelligence reports suggest they have tens of thousands of combat vessels." Admiral Song Hae-jin, commander of the colonial fleet, added her voice to the discussion. "The general is correct about our numbers, but there's something else we need. To consider every species in the galaxy bows to the Corvani. No one has ever successfully resisted them. If we submit now, we might survive as a client species." "Survive as slaves, you mean?" interrupted Representative Lee Jae-on from the Luna colony. "I've read the reports about how the Corvani treat conquered species. They take our resources, our people, our freedom. That's not survival, that's a slow death." President Kim listened to the debate swirling around him, but his mind was already made up. He thought about the footage they had all just watched, about Captain Lee Min-ho choosing to fight rather than surrender, about 12 scientists who died simply because they were human and in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Colleagues," he said, raising his hand for silence, "I know the odds. Know we're facing an empire that has ruled the galaxy for 4,000 years. I know they have more ships, better weapons, and more experience than we could ever dream of having." The chamber fell quiet, waiting for his next words. "But I also know something else," Kim continued. "Throughout our history, humans have faced impossible odds before. We fought against nature, against disease, against tyranny, and against each other. Sometimes we lost, but we never stopped trying. We never accepted that defeat was inevitable. Looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from colonies scattered across human space. The question before us is simple. Do we kneel before an empire that sees us as insects, or do we stand up and fight for our right to exist as free beings? The vote took place in complete silence. One by one, each representative cast their decision. When it was finished, the result was clear: humanity would fight. News of the declaration spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. On trading stations in the Outer Rim, alien merchants stopped their business to stare at the news broadcasts in disbelief. Cities of the Veclan, beings that had submitted to Corvani rule centuries ago, whispered in amazement. Even the proud Zenthari, who had fought 3 wars against the Corvani before accepting defeat, could hardly believe what they were hearing. A species that had only been in space for 2 centuries had declared war on the masters of the galaxy, Emperor. Vecven received the formal declaration of war in his throne room, a massive chamber carved from a single piece of black stone. Round him stood advisors whose families had served the imperial court for generations. The emperor was ancient even by Corvani standards, having ruled for over 300 years. When his communications minister finished reading the human declaration aloud, the throne room fell silent. Then, for the first time in living memory, Emperor Vecvan began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but grew into full, booming laughter that echoed off the stone walls. "Amusing," he said, when his laughter finally stopped. "These humans are either very brave or very stupid. I cannot decide which." He turned to Admiral Vector, who stood among the other military advisors. "Admiral, I am giving you a simple task. Crush these upstart humans quickly and completely. Make an example of them that will remind every species in the galaxy why they should not question Corvani authority." "Many ships should I take, Your Majesty?" Vector asked. "As few as possible," the Emperor replied with a wave of his hand. "I want this to be a training exercise for our newer commanders. End this rebellion before the harvest season begins. I do not want it to interfere with more important matters." Emperor Vecvan did not understand was that humans had spent their entire history doing things that should have been impossible, and they were about to do it again. The Proxima Centauri system had been chosen by Admiral Vector as the perfect place to end the human rebellion quickly. The system contained 3 human colonies and served as a major supply hub for their outer territories. Destroying the human fleet here would cut off half of their space from reinforcements and supplies. Vector stood on the bridge of his flagship as 300 Corvani warships moved into battle formation. Across from them, 50 human vessels waited in what appeared to be a desperate defensive line. The numbers were exactly what the Admiral had expected, 6-to-1 odds in favor of the Corvani. This would be over in hours. "Begin the attack," Vector ordered. "Standard formation. Overwhelm their center and force a surrender." The Corvani fleet moved forward like a wall of death. Their ships were larger, better armed, and crewed by warriors who had never known defeat. Energy beams lanced out across space, striking the human ships with devastating force. But instead of standing their ground or retreating as expected, the human fleet did something that no Corvani tactical manual had ever prepared for. They scattered. "Sir," called his tactical officer, confusion clear in his voice, "the human ships are breaking formation. They're splitting into small groups." Vector watched as the human vessels spread out across the system like seeds in the wind. Some headed for the asteroid belt, others dove toward the planets, and a few even seemed to be running away entirely. It looked like complete chaos. "Follow them," he ordered. "Don't let any escape." But as his ships spread out to pursue the scattered humans, something strange began to happen. The small groups of human vessels weren't running away. They were attacking targets that the Corvani had never thought to defend. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving distress calls from Supply Station Omega-7. They're under attack by human fighters." "Possible," Vector replied. "That station is 50 million kilometers behind our lines." "How did they get there?" Before anyone could answer, more reports flooded in. The main fuel depot was under attack. 3 ammunition transports had been destroyed. A repair facility was sending out emergency signals. Admiral Song Haijin watched the battle unfold from her command ship as it raced through the asteroid belt, pursued by 2 Corvani cruisers. Around her, the bridge crew worked frantically to coordinate the scattered human forces. Commander Yoon Seojin is engaging the fuel depot, reported her tactical officer. He's taken heavy damage, but his squadron is still attacking. Lieutenant Han Nahan's group. They've reached the ammunition convoy. They're making suicide runs, Admiral. 3 of her fighters have already been destroyed, but they're taking out the supply ships. Song Haijin closed her eyes for a moment. She was sending brave men and women to their deaths, but this was the only way humans could fight an enemy this powerful. They couldn't match the Corvani in straight combat, so they had to be smarter, faster, and willing to sacrifice more. Tell all units to continue the mission, she ordered. Every supply ship they destroy means fewer weapons pointed at our colonies. The battle raged for 3 days. What should have been a quick Corvani victory turned into a nightmare of small skirmishes scattered across the entire system. Human pilots like Commander Yoon Seojin became legends as they led desperate attacks against impossible odds. Lieutenant Han Nahan's fighter group destroyed an entire ammunition convoy before being wiped out, but not before transmitting the location of other supply routes to the remaining human forces. Admiral Victor found himself commanding a fleet that was slowly being picked apart by an enemy he could never quite catch. The humans fought like nothing he had ever encountered. They would sacrifice 10 ships to destroy 1 supply transport. They would ram damaged fighters into fuel depots rather than retreat. They fought like every battle was their last. His second-in-command said quietly, "We've lost 37 ships and twice that many supply vessels. The humans have lost most of their fleet. But our supply lines are in chaos." Victor stared at the tactical display. By every measure, the Corvani were winning. They had destroyed more enemy ships, controlled more territory, and suffered fewer casualties. But somehow, it didn't feel like victory. The worst part was what happened next. As news of the battle spread across the galaxy, other species began to pay attention. The Corvani tributary states, who had submitted to imperial rule centuries ago, watched in amazement as human colonies continued to resist even after their fleets were destroyed. Captain Osungho's defense of New Seoul became legendary. With only a few patrol boats and civilian ships, he held off a Corvani invasion force for 6 months. His tactics were insane by any military standard, using cargo ships as improvised weapons, turning mining equipment into defensive systems, and organizing civilian volunteers into guerrilla units. On Titan, Major Kang Arium led a ground campaign that should have been impossible. When the Corvani landed troops to occupy the colony, she organized the miners and engineers into resistance cells. They used their knowledge of the moon's tunnel systems to launch hit-and-run attacks that drove the occupation forces to the edge of madness. "They don't fight like soldiers," Victor confided to his aide after receiving another report of human resistance. "They fight like every person is willing to die rather than surrender." For the first time in 4,000 years, the Corvani Empire was learning what it meant to face an enemy that refused to accept defeat. And across the galaxy, other species were beginning to wonder if the impossible might actually be possible. The massive Corvani warship hung in space like a dark mountain against the stars. Admiral Victor stood on his bridge, watching the human fleet approach. His clawed hands gripped the metal railing as doubt crept into his mind for the first time in decades. 3 years ago, this should have been impossible. The humans were supposed to be dead or enslaved by now. Instead, they had done something no species had ever managed. They had convinced others to fight alongside them against the mighty Corvani Empire. "Sir," his communications officer hissed, "the human admiral is requesting to speak with you." Vector S's yellow eyes narrowed. "Put her through." The screen flickered to life, showing a human woman in a crisp military uniform. Admiral Song Haijin looked tired but determined. Behind her stood other humans. Captain Chen Wujin with his scarred face, Colonel Li Su-yang with her fierce eyes, These were warriors who had survived 3 years of brutal war. Admiral Song Victor began, his voice formal but lacking its usual arrogance. The Emperor has decided to offer you terms. Song's expression didn't change. Terms. 3 years ago, you told us to surrender or die. Now you want to negotiate? Around her bridge, Victor could see not just humans but representatives of other species. The bird-like Xanthari, the blue-skinned Vekilin, and others who had once cowered before Corvani might. They all stood together now, united in their defiance. Your species has proven ... unexpectedly difficult to defeat, Victor admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. The Empire is willing to grant you independence in your current territories. Song leaned forward. That's not enough. We want full recognition for all. Our allies, we want you to leave the contested systems. And we want payment for the worlds you destroyed. The negotiations dragged on for months. Victor found himself in the strange position of being an ambassador instead of a conqueror. He met with the human president Kim Dae-ho on a neutral space station called New Geneva. The human leader was younger than Victor expected, with a gentle face that hid surprising strength. During a break in the talks, Kim approached the Corvani. Admiral, I have to ask, Kim said quietly. Your people have ruled the galaxy for 4,000 years. How did we manage to stop you? Victor was quiet for a long moment, thought about all the battles, all the times he expected the humans to give up, all the moments when any rational species would have surrendered. Your people fought like they had never lost a war, he finally said. My people fought like we had never learned how to lose. There is a difference, Kim nodded. We didn't know we were supposed to be beaten, so we kept fighting. The treaty signing ceremony was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. For the first time in 4 millennia, the Corvani Empire was signing an agreement as equals. Not as masters dictating terms to slaves, representatives from dozens of species gathered to witness the historic moment. The Xanthari delegation wore their finest feathers. The Vekilon sang traditional songs of freedom. Even species that had been neutral watched with amazement as the impossible became reality. As Vecton placed his claw print on the treaty document, he realized that everything had changed. The galaxy would never be the same. His empire would survive, but it would no longer rule over all other life. President. Kim shook hands with him, a human custom that Victor was still learning to understand. The human's grip was firm, but not aggressive, confident, but not arrogant. What happens now? Victor asked. Now we all learn to live as neighbors instead of masters and slaves, Kim replied. Later, alone in his quarters, Victor looked out at the stars. For 4,000 years, his people had believed that strength meant dominance, that power meant control over others. The humans had taught them something different, that sometimes the greatest strength came from refusing to accept defeat. Even when victory seemed impossible, the war was over, but its lessons would echo through the galaxy for generations. Age of absolute rule had ended, brought down by a species too stubborn to know when they were beaten. The Corvani Empire would endure, but it would have to learn to share the galaxy with equals. In the end, it might be a better legacy than conquest ever was.